I'm told you're the dullest linguist. I mean that as a compliment.
I'm uncertain whether to be flattered or concerned.
I cannot tell which one is now.
Bring, brought. Brought.
Think, thought. There are too many versions equally real.
Then I will tell you. This one.
You're here.
The descent pod punched through Miravan's upper atmosphere like it had a personal grudge, and Eli Harrow spent the first 20 minutes of the ride with his knuckles white around the safety restraint and his mouth running silent verb conjugations. Because focusing on irregular past participles was the only reliable method he'd ever found for not thinking about how thoroughly unprepared he was. Through the viewport, the royal moon revealed itself in stages. First the high cloud layer, pale and faintly iridescent, the kind of colour you'd call beautiful in an oil slick if it wasn't also making your eyes water. Then the forest canopy below, vast and dark green shading toward black, which the mission brief had described in chipper academic language as semi-autonomous arboreal ecosystems with documented rudimentary cognition. Trees that think. Great, then. Rising through that canopy like something dreamed up by a civilization with too much ambition and very little concern for human sensory limitations. The palace. He'd looked at photographs. They hadn't helped. The structure was built from living stone and what the cultural briefing called crystallized probability light, which was either poetry or physics depending on who you asked. The spires grew in configurations that made his visual cortex file a quiet complaint. Not because they were ugly, they weren't, exactly, but because they seemed to exist in more spatial dimensions than his eyes were actually equipped to handle. He kept catching angles that didn't resolve correctly, corners that folded the wrong direction, windows that appeared to open onto the same room from 4 different sides at once. His theoretical physicist roommate back on Earth had once explained that psionic civilizations, given enough centuries of collective dreaming and quantum manipulation, eventually began reshaping local geometry, that the architecture of their spaces would slowly reflect the architecture of their minds. Eli had said fascinating at the time and gone back to grading essays on the subjunctive mood. He was regretting that now. First time on a psionic world, the pilot's voice came over the internal comm, dry as burned paper. Is it that obvious? You've been moving your lips for the past hour. Verb drills. Eli stopped moving his lips. Grammar is calming. Sure it is. He could hear the amusement even through comm distortion. She had the particular kind of voice that belonged to someone who'd seen enough of the galaxy that very little surprised her anymore. Academics always retreat into structure when they're terrified. Physicists calculate escape velocities in their heads. Historians start dating architectural details, and linguists do a pause that. I'm not terrified. I'm contextualizing. Right, she didn't push it. He appreciated that. The pod set down on the landing platform with a hydraulic exhale, and Eli's stomach spent a moment reminding him it existed. He gathered his bag, his data tablet, and whatever remained of his professional composure, and stepped out into Miravan's air for the first time. It tasted like ozone and copper, with a faint undercurrent of something floral he couldn't name. Not unpleasant, just deeply, persistently aware of him in a way that Earth's air had never bothered to be. The fine hairs on his arm stood up. He told himself it was atmospheric electricity. He told himself that with some conviction. The welcoming committee was arranged on the platform in a precise formation, a row of palace officials in layered garments that shifted colour in slow, subtle gradations. He'd been briefed on emotive chromatism, fabrics woven with bioreactive compounds that shifted with the wearer's emotional state. The officials' robes were cycling through muted golds and soft greens, which the cultural packet had indicated meant something approximating professional anticipation verging on mild impatience. At the centre of the group stood a figure taller than the rest, wearing robes threaded with embedded circuitry that pulsed in slow, metronomic rhythms, like a heartbeat made visible. Chancellor Druven. He'd read the file thoroughly. Everyone within 6 star systems had read the file. The man had been running the practical machinery of the Luminant Empire since the old king's death 14 years prior, and he ran it with the kind of efficiency that people either called competent governance or iron control, depending entirely on how much they valued the distinction. His expression as Eli crossed the platform was the expression of someone assessing the exact worth of an object and arriving at a number they found disappointing. Professor Harrow. Druven's voice was perfectly modulated, the kind of voice that had been cultivated over decades rather than simply developed. Welcome to Miravan, Chancellor. Eli extended his hand, then remembered mid-motion that the Miravani didn't shake hands. They pressed the backs of their fingers together, a gesture indicating what the briefing had called acknowledged presence without territorial claim. He switched his hand orientation with what he hoped looked like intention. Druven's eyes tracked the adjustment without comment. I trust the journey was uneventful. Very, Eli decided not to elaborate. Excellent. The Chancellor turned, and the officials arranged themselves in formation around them with the practiced ease of people who had long ago learned it was simpler to orbit Druven than to move independently in his vicinity. Her Highness is waiting in the East Wing. I should mention that she has been a precise pause, eager for these lessons to begin. The specific weight he put on eager carried an entire room's worth of unsaid things. Eli filed it under words to revisit and followed him into the palace. The corridors breathed. He'd been told to expect this. Being told and experiencing it were, as it turned out, two entirely different countries separated by a very large body of water. The walls that living stone rose and fell in slow, rhythmic motion that wasn't quite respiration, but was close enough to it that some old, animal part of Eli's brain kept insisting he was walking through something that was also walking. Bioluminescent veins ran through the stone, pulsing in lazy patterns, brightening and dimming in what looked uncomfortably like neural activity. Palace staff moved through the corridors in formations that were just synchronized enough to feel intentional, just organic enough to feel uncoordinated, somewhere between rehearsed and linked. Eli kept his eyes forward and his breathing even, and thought very carefully about nothing whatsoever to do with where he was or what was expected of him. The East Study made a point. Floor-to-ceiling windows on three sides overlooked gardens where the flowers did something he didn't have the vocabulary for, yet not moving in wind, because there was no wind, but moving, slowly and with apparent awareness, tracking things he couldn't see. Shelves lined the fourth wall, filled with data crystals in varying sizes and colours, humming in frequencies that lived just at the threshold of hearing. The floor was the same living stone as the corridors, warm-looking even if not quite warm to the touch. And in the centre of it all, standing at the windows with her back to the door and her arms loosely crossed, was a woman. She was taller than the photographs had suggested. Lena. The mission briefing had provided official portraits formal, composed, the kind of images produced for diplomatic packets and historical records, where the subject had been arranged carefully into an impression of power. The person at the window had the posture of someone who'd been standing there long enough to stop performing and started just existing. Weight shifted to one hip, head tilted slightly towards something outside she was watching. When she turned, Eli had exactly one coherent thought. The photographs had not done an accurate job. It wasn't about her appearance. She matched the description well enough: dark hair falling past her shoulders, golden complexion, the distinctive Miravani ears, longer and more elegantly swept than any human equivalent, catching the light at their edges like polished bronze. It was something the photographs hadn't managed to capture, the quality of her presence in the room. She occupied it differently than most people occupied spaces, more completely, like she was in complete contact with every inch of her surroundings at once, like the room was slightly reorganizing itself around her without either of them noticing. "Professor Harrow," said Princess Kurlindra. Her voice carried harmonics, not supernatural exactly, but richer than a single voice should be, with layers to it that his ears kept trying and failing to fully distinguish. "I've been told you're the most reliably boring linguist currently active in human space." A beat. Eli blinked. "I genuinely can't tell if that's a compliment. Take it as one." She moved toward him, and the air around her shifted in a way that was more like pressure than temperature. Interesting linguists give lectures on phonological drift at state dinners. Boring linguists actually teach people to communicate without starting wars. Given that I need to address a 17-species diplomatic summit in 6 months without accidentally triggering an interstellar incident, I'll take boring over interesting every time. That's a reasonable priority. He glanced back. Druven was still in the doorway, standing with the posture of someone intending to remain present until specifically made not to. Should we start with basic greetings, or jump straight into conditional tenses? I've been known to make conditionals nearly riveting. No one has ever said that. No, he agreed. They really haven't. But I can make them comprehensible, which in my experience matters more. He set his data tablet down on the nearest flat surface. Comprehensible and correctly used is how you get through a 17-species summit without anyone declaring war over a misplaced subjunctive. Something in her expression shifted not quite a smile, but the structural suggestion of one. Behind him, Druven cleared his throat. Your Highness, should any difficulties arise during the session. I know the protocols. Chancellor. Her tone didn't change in volume. Just in temperature dropped several degrees without apparent effort. You may go. He went, the door sealed, and in the silence that followed, Caelindra's posture changed not dramatically, not a visible collapse, but a settling. Like something she'd been holding at a particular tension had been released by about 20%. She looked, just briefly, younger than her file. Right, Eli said. Present tense. Walk me through a sentence in common, whatever comes naturally. She considered. I exist. Present tense. First person singular. Accurate. Also a little bleak. He pulled up the first lesson structure. Something with more movement. I walk. I think. I am trying not to accidentally antagonize 17 galactic representatives in one afternoon. She laughed short, genuine, the kind that surprised the person making it. The data crystals on the shelves shivered very slightly in response. A resonant harmonic he noticed without understanding. You're a strange person, Professor. Occupational hazard. Linguists spend too much time with language and not enough with people. We get odd. They worked through present tense, then into simple past, then into aspects the gap between I walked and I was walking, between I learned and I have learned. Caelindra absorbed distinctions quickly, with the focused efficiency of someone who'd been studying languages since before they could hold a pen. She made mistakes, but productive ones. The kind that meant she was actually building the architecture of the language rather than memorizing surfaces. He revised her on a repeated error with the present perfect. She incorporated the correction immediately and then used it correctly 3 consecutive times. And there was something genuinely satisfying about watching language settle into someone's mind. About 40 minutes in, without looking up from the sentence she was constructing, she said, You're doing that thing. He looked up from his notes. Which thing? That she made a gesture that suggested she was reaching for vocabulary that didn't quite exist in common yet. That professor voice, where everything you say sounds like the most grounded, most immediate thing happening in the universe right now, where the verb conjugation is clearly the only thing that matters. She studied him with a directness that was slightly beyond comfortable. I've had teachers before, tutors, 3 qualified linguists from your species, all of them perfectly competent. None of them, she stopped. None of them what? She shook her head, which wasn't an answer, and went back to her sentence. He let it go. He'd been here 6 hours, and she was a crown princess. Some things would take time. He was mid-explanation of the particular chaos of English perfect aspect, an aspect that had evolved from a Germanic language interbreeding with a Romance language under historical duress, and had never fully recovered when it happened. The first sign was small, the shimmer in the air around her, barely visible, the kind of visual distortion you'd see above summer asphalt, and which absolutely should not have been appearing in a temperature-controlled study. Then the data crystals on the shelves began to vibrate in a frequency that climbed steadily toward the edge of audible. Caelindra had gone still. Her pen was resting against the tablet, not writing. Her eyes had shifted unfocused, pupils contracting and expanding in rapid succession, like they were trying to track multiple things at different distances simultaneously. through the windows. The garden was doing something alarming. The flowers that had been moving in their slow, windless way were now thrashing, caught in something like a hurricane, while the air inside the room remained completely still. The temperature dropped. Eli felt it happen over about 6 seconds, a sharp 10-degree loss with no identifiable source. Every functional instinct he possessed said, step back, give her space, call for medical assistance. He took 3 steps forward instead. He couldn't entirely explain the impulse, then or later. It wasn't heroism, he was reasonably certain of that. It was something closer to the reflex that made him walk towards students who froze in the middle of presentations. The bone-level understanding that sometimes distance is precisely the wrong response. He stopped close enough to see the fine tremor running through her entire frame, hands, shoulders, the slight unsteadiness in how she was holding her weight, and he said, in the flattest, most deliberately unremarkable voice he could produce, this would be an excellent moment to practice the present continuous tense, as in, I am currently wondering whether any of this is covered under my travel insurance. Her eyes snapped to his face. Something pulled back her attention, returning from wherever it had been travelling, anchoring to this room, this moment, this aggressively mundane grammatical observation. The pressure eased in stages. The crystals fell silent. The lights steadied. The flowers outside sank back into their slow, windless rhythm. The temperature began to climb back toward normal. Calindra stared at him. I am currently trying to determine, she said, slowly, enunciating each word with the precision of someone checking that language still worked. Whether you are very brave or simply not paying enough attention to be appropriately frightened. Those aren't mutually exclusive. His heart was moving faster than he was willing to let his voice admit. How are you? Like I almost wasn't, she said. And it was the most precise description of whatever had just happened that he thought he was going to get. The door opened before he could respond. The medical team entered at speed, 5 people, carrying scanning equipment and flat crystalline devices they pressed efficiently to her temples. Reading data from instruments he had no framework to interpret. They worked with the practiced ease of people who had run this response protocol more times than they wanted to. Druven appeared in the doorway behind them, watching with an expression that communicated this had happened before, frequently. Professor Harrow, the lead physician, not unkind but businesslike. Her Highness needs rest. You're excused for the evening. He was escorted out by a guard who said nothing, through corridors that were still quietly breathing, to quarters that were considerably nicer than anything his salary had ever rated him, on earth-high windows overlooking the garden. Furniture that appeared to have grown upward from the floor rather than been placed on it. He stood at the window for a long time without doing anything particularly useful. The garden below pulsed in slow, complex patterns, the flowers moving in rhythms that were nothing like wind and increasingly looked like something deliberate. Eventually, he opened a new notes file on his data tablet and stared at it for a while before writing anything. What he finally wrote was, correlation is not causation, but it's interesting. It is very, very interesting. His communication terminal chimed 40 minutes later. A message from Caelindra, routed through official palace channels. Subject line, lesson notes. Professor Harrow, the irregular verbs were almost helpful. Almost because I'm still not entirely sure what the present perfect continuous is for. But I was paying attention, which apparently counts. Same time tomorrow. Try to be more boring if possible. I mean that as a specific clinical recommendation. See, he typed back. I have a module on semicolons that has empirically induced drowsiness in graduate students. We'll begin there. Outside, Miravan's twin stars dropped below the tree line, and the palace lit up in slow stages with its own stored light. The room's automated system offered him something it claimed was analogous to coffee, which turned out to taste like regret with undertones of burned licorice. He sat with it at the window and watched the garden and tried to think clearly about what tomorrow was going to look like. He was a linguist. He taught language. He was here to get a crown princess through a diplomatic summit without an international incident. He had a feeling that description of the job was about to stop being sufficient. The not coffee tasted slightly less like regret by the end. He decided to count that as progress. Chapter 2. The 30% Problem. The throne room was not built to make visitors feel comfortable, and it succeeded at this without apparent effort. Eli arrived at first light, which on Miravan meant the moment both stars cleared the eastern ridge and flooded the palace's upper levels with the particular golden copper light that made everything look like it was happening inside an old photograph. A guard met him at the corridor junction outside his quarters and said nothing beyond this way, which was the kind of conversational efficiency he could respect. They moved through 3 levels of the palace, through a set of doors that opened by rearranging themselves rather than swinging, and into a space that made the east study look modest. The throne room had no ceiling Eli could identify. The walls climbed until they became something else, not open sky, but not ceiling either. More like the space above simply stopped asserting itself. Light moved through the upper architecture in slow, directional beams, illuminating a floor of polished stone that reflected everything around it with the slightly too perfect accuracy of still water. And on a raised platform at the room's far end, seated in something that was less a throne and more a statement made out of crystallized living rock, was Aethara, Queen Regent of the Luminant Empire. She was younger than her official title implied, mid-50s, maybe, by human reckoning, though the mission file had noted that Miravani aging was close to Terran in its visible effects than some human analysts expected. She had Kaelindra's colouring, Kaelindra's bone structure, and a version of Kaelindra's quality of presence, though, where the princess's presence had the texture of something becoming, something unresolved and in motion. The regent's was finished, settled into itself. The kind of stillness that came from years of choosing exactly how much of yourself to show in any given room. She gestured before he'd finished crossing the floor. A seat materialised beside him, stone flowing upward from the floor like something growing on time-lapse. Professor Harrow, sit, not unkind, just efficient. We have much to discuss and limited time for the kind of elaborate courtesies that usually open these conversations, so I'll skip them. My niece is dying. Eli sat down faster than intended. The regent continued as though she hadn't just dropped that sentence into the conversation like a stone into still water. Not immediately. She has perhaps 5 months, possibly 6 if her condition stabilises. That estimate comes from our best physicians working from the best available data. It is not good data, and they are not optimistic. She folded her hands. Unless we find a way to manage what's happening to her. Eli chose his words carefully. I read the medical summary they sent before I arrived. It mentioned elevated empathic sensitivity and intermittent telepathic dysregulation. It did not mention. No, it wouldn't have. What I'm about to tell you is information we've released to fewer than a dozen people outside the immediate medical team. She held his gaze with the directness of someone who'd spent decades watching people under difficult news and had learned to not soften it. What you witnessed last night wasn't a standard episode of dysregulation. It was the beginning of Ketharasin. The word meant nothing to him. He said so. Ketharasin. She repeated it carefully, giving him the Miravani pronunciation. There is no accurate translation into common, so I'll describe it. Every 7 or 8 generations, sometimes longer, one of our people undergoes a fundamental restructuring of their telepathic architecture. The entire psionic capacity breaks down to its basic components and rebuilds in a new configuration, a more powerful configuration. A pause. Those who survive the process emerge as the most capable minds our species has ever recorded, for psionics of a depth and precision that define the centuries around them. Those who don't. She touched something on the armrest of the throne, and the air between them shimmered into a 3-dimensional display Miravani physiology. He guessed. From the structural diagrams. A figure in the centre of it began to fold inward, slowly, with horrible elegance. The psychic discharge from a failed Ketharasin can devastate several hundred square kilometres. That's a significant design flaw, I said, before he could stop himself. Aethara looked at him with something that might, in a different context, have been appreciation. Evolution rarely consults our preferences. Ketharasin manifests during periods of species-level threat, biological response to existential pressure. The survivors become precisely what we need to survive, whatever triggered it. The alternative to this process is extinction, and our species has chosen not to go extinct on several occasions now. She dismissed the display with a flick of her fingers. Caelindra began showing symptoms 3 months ago. Emotional amplification, feeling things at twice the normal intensity and broadcasting them at range. Loss of fine telepathic control. And, increasingly, what the physicians call temporal displacement episodes, where she experiences multiple simultaneous timelines rather than a singular present moment. She becomes unstuck, Eli said slowly, working through it, in time, in probability. Correctly understood, the Regent's gaze sharpened. And you see, now, why last night was interesting. He'd suspected she was going somewhere with this. He waited. In the past 3 months, Caelindra has experienced 114 documented episodes. The average duration, even with our best pharmaceutical intervention, is between 40 and 90 minutes. During severe episodes, we've used physical restraints. She said it without inflection. Last night's episode began at standard intensity and resolved in 11 minutes. Without pharmaceutical intervention, without restraints, without any direct medical involvement prior to stabilization. A beat. It resolved when you moved closer and began speaking. Eli sat with that for a moment. The monitoring equipment was already running. It runs continuously. We have complete biometric data for the full episode. She looked at him steadily. When you crossed to her side, her readings dropped 47%. When you spoke, another 31. By the time our team arrived, she had returned to baseline. That could be coincidence. Confounded timing, spontaneous resolution, it could be. Which is why you'll continue these lessons under full monitoring, and we will observe every variable we can measure. She stood, and Eli stood automatically. Chancellor Druven believes we should be following traditional isolation protocols. Sequester her in the deep sanctum. Limit all external stimuli. Allow the process to run its course. A pause, historically. That approach has a survival rate of approximately 30%. Those are terrible odds. They are, which is why I'm overruling him. She moved from the platform with the ease of someone who'd spent decades in formal spaces and no longer noticed them. You'll have 4 hours daily with Caelindra in monitored sessions. If your presence is genuinely stabilizing, we need to understand how and why. If it isn't, she didn't finish. She didn't need to. Get some breakfast. Professor, you have a lesson at 9. He got breakfast. It tasted fine. He barely noticed. The session that morning took place not in the East Study, but in a space the guards called the Resonance Garden, an enclosed courtyard in the palace's mid-level, open to the sky but screened by a transparent barrier that kept weather and wind outside while letting light through. Every surface hummed stone, pathways, the curved walls at frequencies that live just at the lower edge of audible, like the bass note of a chord being played 3 rooms away. Eli had been told this was deliberate. The frequencies interacted with elevated psionic states in ways the physicians described as moderating. Though they'd been careful about claiming mechanism, Caelindra was already there when he arrived. She was sitting cross-legged on a platform that actually floated, 2 feet above an ornamental pond. No visible mechanism, with a data tablet in her lap and the look of someone who'd had a worse night than they were going to admit. The shadows under her eyes weren't dramatic. They were the kind that came from sleeping badly for weeks, and were so established now that she'd stopped noticing them. "You were briefed," she said, before he'd finished setting his bag down. "Not quite a question." "Yes." "About Kethorasin. Not just the elevated empathic sensitivity version. The real version." He pulled up the day's lesson plan and looked at it without really seeing it. "I'm sorry. About what you're going through. Don't be sorry." She said it without sharpness, just matter of fact. Sorry doesn't help the timeline, and the timeline is the actual problem. Her platform drifted a few inches, a slow, unconscious movement. What did Aunt Lasara tell you exactly? The 30% survival rate, or the part where the 30% who don't survive take several hundred square kilometers with them? Both. Actually, she likes you then. She usually saves the second part for people she's decided can handle information. Kalindra looked at him sideways. Can you? I'm still here. She considered this, then nodded as though it satisfied some internal criterion. The actual technical problem, she said, shifting into the efficient mode he was beginning to recognize as a default when discussing things that frightened her, is that my mind keeps trying to exist in multiple places at once. Multiple timelines. It's like she searched for language and he could see her working through Common's available metaphors and finding them inadequate, like standing at the junction of every road you've ever walked, simultaneously. Past and present and possible futures all equally real, equally present, all pulling in different directions. The self gets, she opened her hand, then closed it distributed. And when that happens outside of controlled conditions, I take the local architecture with me. She looked out at the garden. The flowers were moving in their slow, directionless way, though he was beginning to suspect that directionlessness was an illusion on his end. 3 weeks ago, there was an episode in the West Corridor. We had to have 7 doors rebuilt afterward. Eli processed this. Then, because there wasn't much else to do with it. Right, present perfect tense. Because you've clearly been having a difficult few weeks, and we're going to talk about all of it in correctly constructed English. She turned to look at him fully. Something in her expression was doing something complicated. You know what's strange about you? I've been told there's a list. Be specific. Every other person who deals with me now tutors. Physicians. My aunt. The palace staff, they all move around me like they're waiting for something to happen. Like I'm a thing that might fall over and they need to be ready to catch it. It's unconscious. I don't think they know they're doing it. She tilted her head. You just sit down and start talking about verb tenses. The verb tenses need doing. He opened the lesson file. Also, I don't have telepathy. Maybe I'm just not picking up whatever signal the rest of them are. Maybe. She sounded like she wasn't convinced. Or maybe the signal is exactly the problem and the absence of it is exactly the point. But she opened her own tablet. Present perfect. I have been trying to contain several consecutive spatial dimensions. I have not succeeded. Is that right? Grammatically, yes. The only problem is several understates it. She laughed. He noticed the way it changed the air around her fractionally, the shimmer easing, the hum of the garden stone surfaces shifting in frequency by something measurable if you had equipment and something perceptible if you were just paying attention. He was paying attention. They worked through the morning with the pattern he was starting to build. Deliberate pacing, flat delivery, staying in the immediate present of the lesson rather than the surrounding situation. When she made an error, he corrected it directly, without cushioning. When she got something right, he acknowledged it without ceremony. He kept his voice at the particular pitch and register that years of student observation had taught him was the most consistently grounding, not soothing. Exactly. Soothing had a falseness to it that people with high emotional sensitivity tended to detect and resent. This was something more like steady, the voice of someone who was not alarmed. Around the 90-minute mark, with a particularly elaborate conditional construction taking up his attention. He looked up and noticed she was watching him instead of her tablet. What? He said. Your voice changed. She said it like she was reporting data. About 20 minutes ago, you shifted into a different register. I was explaining a complicated construction. I usually pace it differently when... No, before that. When you noticed my field destabilizing. I didn't say anything. I barely noticed it myself. But your whole cadence changed. She was studying him with that direct, slightly beyond comfortable quality again. You slowed down, dropped the pitch, kept the sentences short and declarative. He'd done that. He hadn't consciously decided to. Habit, he said. Students who are starting to get lost in complex material show certain signs. I adjust. I wasn't getting lost in the material. She looked at him carefully. You were responding to something else. He didn't have an answer for that. He went back to the conditional construction. After a moment, she followed. Later, after the session ended and the monitoring team had cycled through their measurements and Kaelindra had gone with them for the post-session medical review, he sat with the lesson recording and went through the monitoring data that the palace system had flagged for him. The full biometric panel was beyond his ability to interpret completely, but some of it was readable from the annotations. And there it was, nested in the data, the moment he'd noticed in real time but not fully processed. 22 minutes into the session, Caelindra's field stability readings had started declining gradually, not yet alarming, but trending toward an episode. He'd shifted his speech pattern automatically. Her readings had levelled. 15 minutes later they'd climbed. He sat with this for a while, then opened the medical file. The regent had given him access. Most of it was beyond him, but a section near the end, marked with the palace's highest clearance classification, had been made accessible by someone her. He assumed with a straightforward annotation. Read this. He read it. Cetharasin subjects who do not achieve stabilization within 4 months of symptom onset experience progressive psychic fragmentation. In the final stage, consciousness ceases to exist within a single timeline and distributes across parallel probability states. No recorded case of full fragmentation has resulted in survival of a coherent self. The process is irreversible beyond a threshold that current measurement cannot precisely identify, but which clinical observation places between 4 and 5 months post-onset. Caelindra had been symptomatic for 3 months. Eli closed the file and stared at the wall for a minute. Outside the window, the garden continued its slow, inexplicable movements. The air tasted of copper and something faintly floral, and the weight of a clock he hadn't known was running. He opened a message to Caelindra's official channel and typed, "I've been thinking about semicolons. I think we should build an entire session around them. They're arguably the most psychologically interesting punctuation mark in common, and I have opinions, strong, boring opinions." Tomorrow, the reply came 11 minutes later. That is, either the most desperate thing anyone has ever said to me or the most considerate. And I haven't decided which. Yes. Tomorrow. Bring the semicolons. He stared at it for a moment, then added it to his notes file under data points without examining why. He prepared the next lesson plan, ordered more of the not coffee, and told himself firmly that he was doing his job. He was here to get her through a diplomatic summit. He was going to do his job. The not coffee tasted exactly like regret again. He drank it anyway. He would later identify the exact session in which he crossed the line from this is professionally interesting to I am in significant trouble. It was a Thursday. Miravan technically didn't organise time by Earth weekdays, but he'd been keeping his own internal calendar, and it was a Thursday. They were in the resonance garden as usual. 3 weeks in, working on conditional mood constructions. Caelindra had taken to the conditional with what he could only describe as an enthusiasm that had slightly alarmed him, given that the conditional was the grammatical structure of hypotheticals, of things that might have been, could have been, would have been a tense built around imagining alternate outcomes. He'd mentioned this and she'd said yes. I know, that's why I like it in a tone that closed the subject. If I were not a crown princess, she was saying, working through a construction he'd given her as an exercise. I would have left this moon before the symptoms started. Found somewhere quiet. Let the universe keep its evolutionary agenda to itself. Grammatically correct. Existentially grim. The conditional lends itself to grim. She tilted her head. Your turn. Complete the construction. If I had not accepted this assignment, I would be in my office on Earth grading 40 essays on morphological derivation and slowly becoming part of the furniture. Is that what your life was? That's a generous description of it. She looked at him with a curiosity that didn't have anything performative in it, not the social curiosity of polite conversation, but the genuine article, the kind that actually wanted information. Why did you come here? I've read your file. You were at one of the top 5 linguistics programs in human space. Tenured at, she checked something on her tablet 34. Students who went on to their own departments. You were, by every external measurement. Someone with a career that was going well. It was. So why leave it? For she gestured at the garden. The palace. Possibly the concept of Miravan in general. He thought about the several versions of a diplomatic answer he could give. Then thought about the fact that she had a very well-documented ability to detect things that weren't quite accurate. Because doing something well and finding it meaningful are different things, he said. And I'd spent about 4 years being very competent at work that had stopped mattering to me. Every class was the same class. Every paper was a variation of papers I'd read before. I was building a career that looked, from the outside, exactly like everything I was supposed to want. He looked out the garden. Then someone offered me something I genuinely didn't know how to do yet. And I said yes before I'd thought about it, which is either impulsiveness or instinct, and I still don't know which. Maybe both, she said quietly. Probably. She was quiet for a moment. The garden hummed around them, and the twin stars were at the angle where they threw long parallel shadows across the courtyard stones. I've had tutors before you. 3, for common specifically. They're all competent, kind, even. She picked up a small data crystal from the arrangement beside her, turned it in her fingers. They all flinched. He looked at her. When the field instability starts even mild fluctuations. Nothing like what you saw that first evening. There's a pressure that other people perceive, a kind of cognitive and emotional weight that builds in the space around me. She set the crystal down. Everyone who's near me now, even people who genuinely care, they feel it and they react. Even Aunt Lysara, even the physicians who've been with me for months. There's a moment, when it starts, when they pull back even slightly. Brace, she looked at him steadily. You don't. I told you, no telepathy. It's not about telepathy. They're not reading my surface thoughts. They're feeling the field pressure. And you should be feeling it too. It operates below the threshold of psionic perception. But you don't change. She was very still. When it starts happening, the shimmer, the destabilization, your voice doesn't change because you're alarmed. It changes because you noticed something that needed adjusting, and you adjusted it. Like it's a problem to solve rather than a danger to prepare for. Isn't it a problem to solve? She looked at him in a way that did something complicated to the air between them. Yes, she said. Finally, I suppose it is. The session ran another 20 minutes. They finished the conditional constructions and moved into reported speech, which was more technical and less emotionally interesting. And by the time they wrapped, the afternoon light had gone amber through the garden canopy, and her readings had been stable for 2.5 hours straight, which the monitoring team's physician noted in a voice that was carefully not expressing how significant that was. Walking back through the breathing corridors, Eli ran a quiet, honest inventory of the past 3 weeks. She was brilliant, which he'd expected. She was funny in a way that crept up on you and then landed cleanly, which he hadn't. She was more genuinely curious than most academics he'd known, with an appetite for ideas that didn't stop at the edge of her own field. She talked about physics and governance and evolution and history with the same appetite, the same directness, and she expected him to push back when he disagreed, and she reconsidered when he made a good point, which in his experience was rarer than it should be in people with significantly less power than she had. He reached his quarters and stood at the window for a while without turning the lights on. He was a linguist. He was here to do a job. He was going to need to be very careful about how thoroughly he didn't examine certain things. Outside, the flowers pussed in patterns that were starting to look familiar. Chapter 3, The Science of Staying. The formal council session was announced on a Monday, which Eli thought was appropriate. Nothing good had ever started on a Monday. Chancellor Druven's request for an emergency council review had been circulating through official palace channels for 4 days before Lysara finally granted it, which Caelindra said was her aunt's way of making clear that she was allowing it rather than responding to it, a distinction that mattered. Politically, even if the outcome was the same room with the same people saying the same things they'd been saying in private corridors for 3 weeks. You should know what you're walking into, Caelindra said the morning before, during their session in the Resonance Garden. She was working through reported speech constructions she said that she would. He asked whether she had, but her attention kept drifting toward the middle distance in a way that wasn't destabilization, just preoccupation. Druven has support. Not a majority, but enough to make things uncomfortable. There are houses that have been pushing for traditional isolation protocols since the beginning, and he's been cultivating that support carefully. Should I be preparing a defence? Not exactly. You'll be standing in the observer's circle. You're not technically a party to the proceeding. She paused over a construction, corrected it herself before he could. Continued. But Druven will address you directly at some point. He always does. He thinks it unsettles people. Being spoken to by him in formal session when they don't have the floor. Does it work? Usually. She glanced at him sideways. He hasn't met many people who are constitutionally resistant to being unsettled. Eli thought about this. I'll take that as a preparatory warning. Take it as whatever helps. She looked back at her tablet. The council chamber has an acoustic amplification system built into the architecture. Everything said in there carries farther and with more resonance than normal speech. It's designed to make declarations feel like declarations. Just be aware of that. Meaning don't say anything I wouldn't want amplified. Meaning think before you speak, which I understand is a challenge for academics with strong opinions about logical fallacies. He conceded that point without argument. The council chamber made the throne room look like somewhere people were meant to feel at ease. It was structured in a deep curve. Tiered seating along the walls rising toward the upper levels. The central floor space open and deliberately exposed nowhere to stand that wasn't visible from at least 4 different elevations. Representatives from the major Miravani noble houses lined the tiers in formal robes that ran the full spectrum of political affiliation, which Eli had spent an evening trying to memorize from the briefing materials and which he now discovered he'd only partially retained. Enough to identify the traditionalist bloc by the deep indigo and silver. Not enough to read much beyond that. Chancellor Druven stood at the central speaking position with the composure of someone who'd been building toward this moment for several weeks and had enjoyed every step of the construction. Kalindra stood to Eli's left in the observer's circle, straight-backed, her expression doing that thing it did in formal context, where she removed everything from it that could be used. Aethara sat above them on the regent's seat, elevated and still. Her face arranged into a neutrality that Eli suspected cost her some effort. Druven began with history. This was, Eli thought. A tactical choice history gave you the weight of precedent. Made your argument feel less like opinion and more like restoration of proper order. He laid out the record of Ketharasian management across the past 8 centuries. The protocols developed, refined, standardized. The importance of uncontaminated process. The spiritual and biological significance of the transformation proceeding without interference. He spoke well. His voice was the kind that made statements feel inevitable. The traditional protocols, Druven concluded, exist not because our ancestors were without compassion. They exist because they understood that Ketharasian cannot be managed from the outside. The attempt to manage it risks corrupting the process itself, producing not a stronger mind, but a compromised one, dependent, anchored to an external source rather than its own foundations. His gaze moved to Eli with the precision of a controlled movement. We now employ a human linguist who has been on this moon for less than a month. A man whose neural architecture is fundamentally different from our own. And we are watching his presence alter the princess's psychic patterns in ways we cannot fully model, in a process we do not fully understand, during a transformation that has historically required isolation above all other things. He let that sit in the amplified air of the chamber. I ask this council, is short-term symptom reduction worth the risk of long-term architectural damage to one of the most significant minds our species may produce? The chamber held its murmuring response for a moment, not quite agreement, but engagement. The sound of people who'd been thinking these things privately and were now hearing them said out loud. Aethara spoke before Druven could continue. The Chancellor's concerns are noted. Her Highness's physician will present the current clinical data. The physician, a quiet, precise woman named Sariel, whom Eli had interacted with during monitoring sessions, moved to the speaking position. She presented 3 weeks of biometric data in clear, flat language. The kind that didn't editorialize but didn't need to. Episode frequency down 63%. Severity index down by half. Duration of stable intervals up by a factor of 4. The numbers were the argument. Druven acknowledged them without conceding them. Frequency and severity are measurable. What are we not measuring? What are we missing because we don't yet have instruments for it. We're measuring everything our instruments can reach, Sariel said evenly. Yes. And the history of medicine is largely a record of things that were happening before we developed instruments to detect them. It was, Eli had to admit, a reasonably good point, which made it more irritating rather than less. He was standing in the observer's circle, which in theory meant he was there to observe and not to participate. He was watching the chamber's response to Druven's argument and calculating, involuntarily, the way he calculated things in academic debate when someone had made a point that was formally structured but substantively hollow. He heard himself speak. I wonder if there's supporting evidence for the contamination hypothesis. The chamber went quiet with the particular quality of a room that has just recalibrated. Eli registered, about half a second after the words left his mouth, that every eye in the room was now pointing at him, that the acoustic amplification had carried his voice to every tier, that he was standing in an observer's circle, which was not a speaking position. Lysara's expression flickered something that might, on a person with less composure, have been alarm, and then she said, in a tone that absolutely meant the opposite, Professor Harrow, please. Meaning, continue, he'd apparently committed. I mean that sincerely. Chancellor Druven's argument rests on the premise that my presence is causing harm, that we're not detecting contaminating the transformation in some latent way that current instruments miss. That's a meaningful concern. But it's a hypothesis without supporting evidence, and I'm not sure how different. Therefore, potentially dangerous distinguishes itself from standard xenophobic precaution dressed in medical language. He kept his voice level, measured, the professor voice. If there's data suggesting harm, I'd genuinely like to see it. If there isn't, I'd suggest the council consider that a living princess with a compromised transformation is a better outcome than a theoretically pure transformation she doesn't survive. The chamber's quiet deepened for about 3 full seconds. Then it erupted into noise, not chaos, but the elevated murmuring of a large room full of people with strong opinions, all of which were now activated simultaneously. Cael, to his left, made a sound he couldn't fully interpret. Suppressed laugh, choked breath, possibly both. Druven's expression was the expression of someone watching a structural failure they'd predicted and were now recording for the official record. You dare accuse this council of prejudice? I suggested that different equals dangerous is a logical fallacy rather than a scientific principle. Whether that constitutes prejudice is a question the council can consider on its own merits. The harm may not be immediately measurable, said a council member from the upper tier older, deep indigo robes, the representative of one of the oldest traditionalist houses. Her voice had the weight of someone who'd outlasted several political administrations. Caetharasin survivors emerge as our most capable minds precisely because they endure the full transformation. If we suppress the symptoms, we may produce a lesser result, a mind that is stabilised rather than fully realised. With respect, Eli said, a lesser result that's alive seems preferable to a full result that isn't. You oversimplify. He really doesn't. Caelindra's voice carried across the chamber without effort, the harmonics in it vibrating the room's crystal elements slightly. The current actuarial projections give me 4 weeks at the present rate of decline before fragmentation becomes irreversible. Every day of stability that Professor Harrow's presence provides is a day I continue to exist in a single timeline rather than distributed across several dozen parallel ones. A pause. I find I'm quite attached to existing in a single timeline. It's a personal preference. Druven pivoted smoothly. Your Highness, with respect, your attachment to the Professor may itself be symptomatic. Caetharasin amplifies all emotional states, including I see. Her voice cooled several degrees. So if I find his presence helpful, it's a symptom. If I opposed it, that would be clear-headed judgment. How convenient that your logic only works in one direction. Lysara stood. The chamber fell into silence with the immediate, practiced quality of a room that had learned what standing meant. The council's concerns are formally received, she said. Professor Harrow will continue under enhanced monitoring. If the data supports any indication of harm, we will revisit. Until then, her gaze moved to Druven. with a precision that suggested she'd been waiting to use it. We prioritise the heir's survival over theoretical purity. If the Chancellor wishes to explain to the Empire why we chose otherwise, I'll give him the floor to prepare that explanation now. Druven said nothing. The session closed. The corridor outside was less a corridor and more a release valve. Everyone filing through it, carrying the energy of a room that had just had an argument. Representatives moved in clusters, quiet-voiced. The political sorting process happening in real time, who stood where. Who was now aligned with whom. Eli walked with Calindra toward the eastern wing, one pace behind her and to her left, which was apparently the formal position for people in his category. He wasn't entirely sure what his category was. He was working on it, that was, Calindra said. Not breaking stride, either very brave or very reckless. Possibly both. I'm told I don't know when to stop talking. You were told correctly. She glanced at him sideways. Thank you. For not backing down. You were making a better argument than him. It seemed worth supporting. She looked at him, the full attention of it. Not the sideways assessment, but the direct version. Held for long enough to mean something. Then she looked forward again. Can I ask you something? And I want an actual answer. Not whatever diplomatic version you'd give to the official inquiry. I'll do my best. Are you afraid of me? He considered the question seriously, which she waited for. No, why not? I don't think I have a satisfying scientific answer for that. The corridor opened into the eastern wing. The windows on this level overlooking the city below towers of pale stone threaded with bioluminescence, a skyline that pulsed in slow. Breathing cycles. I can see that something is happening with you that's significant and potentially dangerous, but I don't experience it as a threat. I experience it as a situation. A situation. She repeated. A situation I'm trying to help with. He glanced at her. The 3 tutors before me. What happened with them? The first one lasted 8 days before she requested reassignment, which I don't blame her for. The second one was still here when the episode started getting worse. He never said anything explicit, but you could see it in how he moved around me. Every session he sat a little farther back. A pause. The third one genuinely tried. Stayed for 6 weeks after the symptoms started. He was kind. But there's a kind that's really just a sophisticated form of distance. And kindness from 3 feet farther than normal still adds up to distance. The city hummed below them. Somewhere in the lower levels, a market quarter was busy. Lights moving in the pattern of people. You said this morning, Eli said carefully, that my voice changes when your field destabilizes. That you've noticed it. Yes, I didn't decide to do that. I noticed something and I responded to it. But it wasn't a calculation. He watched the city for a moment. I want to say something and I want to say it correctly. That's a linguist's opening line. Fair. He thought about it. What I'm doing in our sessions, the pacing, the register, the way I redirect when things start shifting, I do some version of that with every student who's struggling. It's not specific to you, but what is specific to you is that He stopped, tried again. I find that the room is different when you're not in it. She said nothing. He watched a light on the city skyline pulse and go dark and come back. That's probably a lot of things, he said. The work is more interesting than anything I've done in years. The situation is objectively high stakes, which focuses the mind. And he stopped again. Careful, she said softly. Not a warning, just an observation. Yes. He looked at her. Yes, I'm being careful. Because you're a crown princess, and I'm a linguist on a 6-month diplomatic assignment, and neither of those things is going to change. But I wanted to be honest about the fact that I'm being careful on purpose. Because the alternative is pretending that what's happening in that garden every morning is only about grammar. The corridor was very quiet. Then the alarm went off. Not the low resonant pulse of the standard alert system, something sharper. Operating at a frequency that bypassed the ears and went straight to the nervous system. Red light flooded the corridor from the emergency strips in the ceiling. And Calindra swayed. He caught her arm before he'd thought about it. Hey, with me. I'm here. Her voice was strained. Give me a but the walls were going translucent. Not gradually in stages. Solid stone becoming glass-like. Then something beyond glass. Then almost nothing at all. revealing ghostly overlaid images of other corridors, other configurations of the same space, other versions of the palace occupying the same coordinates in space but different positions in time. Through the translucent wall to his right, he could see the same corridor as it had been 20 years ago. The architecture slightly different, the lighting different, one doorway not yet built. Through the wall to his left, a version where the window didn't exist, where the stone was unbroken, where the city below was darker and smaller. "I can see them," Cael said, and the fear in her voice was the specific fear of someone who'd been afraid of this for months and was now inside it. All the versions, all the minus. "Fly, flew, flown," Eli said. She blinked. "Bring, brought, brought." He put both hands on her shoulders, steady grip, and felt the tremor running through her fine and continuous, like a vibration at the edge of what hands could detect. "Think, thought, thought. Look at me. Just look at me, not the walls. The walls are showing me. I know what they're showing you. Look at me, anyway." He waited until her eyes locked on his. Feel, felt, felt, catch, caught, caught. This is not the time for teach. Taught. He kept his voice absolutely level. The drill sergeant monotone that he'd been told was deeply annoying in academic contexts and which seemed, in this context, to be the right tool entirely. Speak, spoke, spoken, hold, held, held. Something in her breathing changed, lengthened. The fine tremor in her shoulders didn't stop, but it began to slow. "You're insane," she said, and it was a single voice now strained, but one voice. Not the chorus of temporal harmonics he'd heard building underneath it a moment ago. Possibly. Seek, sought, sought. The rhythm helps. Your mind is looking for a pattern to organize around, and irregular verb lists are one of the most consistently patterned things in common. It's not elegant, but it works. Drive, drove. Driven, she said, with the ghost of something that wasn't quite a laugh. You're unbelievable. No, knew, known. She said it with him, and somewhere in saying it, the fractures in the corridor walls sealed themselves. The overlapping timelines faded, not gone, not resolved, but receding like tide, pulling back from shore. The stone became stone again. The light returned to normal. Her weight, which had been partially against his hands, steadied. She pulled in one long breath and let it go. He became aware, in the returning quiet, that his own heart was going significantly faster than his voice had suggested, that his hands on her shoulders were not entirely steady, that the corridor smelled like ozone and something electrical, and that somewhere behind the far wall, something had been damaged. He could hear a faint, crystalline sound, like glass rearranging itself. "Okay," he said, quietly. "Okay, okay," she repeated. Then, Eli. It was the first time she'd used his name without the title. He noted it with the part of his brain that noted things, and filed it immediately in a folder he wasn't going to examine right now. "I'm here." But the guards were arriving. Not her guards, the palace's general response team, coming from the eastern corridor at speed, and behind them a second group, moving with the deliberate efficiency of a plan being executed rather than a crisis being responded to. They carried equipment. He looked at the equipment for a moment and registered, with a cold feeling that had nothing to do with the corridor's temperature, that it wasn't the monitoring array he'd seen in the resonance garden. It wasn't the dampening equipment the medical team carried. It was restraints. "Stand away from the princess," the lead officer said, formal, rehearsed, specifically rehearsed. Caelindra's hand had found his arm at some point, he wasn't sure when. Her grip was steady now, the tremor gone. He stabilized the episode. "Whatever you've been told, Your Highness." The officer's voice was carefully without inflection. "Your attachment to the professor has been flagged as potentially symptomatic. We have orders." Whose orders? Nobody answered that directly. Nobody needed to. Druven's name hung in the air of the corridor as clearly as if it had been spoken. They were efficient about it. He could have objected, considered it briefly, decided it would make things worse for her in a way he didn't want to add to. He let them take him through the lower levels, through doors that sealed behind them, into a room in the palace's lower architecture where the stone didn't breathe, and the air tasted recycled, and the only light came from a strip in the ceiling that never changed its intensity. The guard who sealed the door looked at him for a moment, with the expression of someone who had opinions they weren't authorized to voice. "For what it's worth," he said, "most of us think you were helping." "But the Chancellor made a compelling argument," Eli said. "The Chancellor made an argument to the Regent that your continued presence, if removed now rather than later, would cause complete psychic collapse. That the dependency he's been warning about had already formed." The guard's expression shifted into something carefully neutral. "She made the call based on whatever she made it based on. I don't get to weigh in on that." The door closed. Eli sat down on the bench, the only furniture the room contained, and thought about timing, and Druven's very particular tactical patience, and what it meant that the Chancellor had waited for a significant episode to make his move, had possibly waited for a significant episode, knowing that a significant episode would be coming regardless of whether he'd done anything to encourage it. Above him, somewhere in the palace's upper levels, Caelindra was navigating the aftermath of a temporal displacement episode without him. 3 weeks of stabilization, now suddenly removed. 4 weeks, the medical file had said. Maybe less. He thought about what the guard hadn't quite said, that the Chancellor had argued that removing the dependency now, rather than later, was the medically responsible choice. That too much stabilization too quickly was more dangerous than controlled fragmentation. He thought about the fact that Druven was not stupid, and had probably calculated this very carefully, and that the calculation served him in 2 ways simultaneously. Then he stopped thinking about Druven, because there was nothing productive in that direction, and focused on the one thing in his immediate control, being in this room, in this moment, and not fragmenting across alternate timelines himself. He had significantly fewer timelines available than Caelindra did. He could manage. Somewhere above him, the palace continued to breathe. He listened to it for a while, and then he didn't, because he was very tired, and the bench was not comfortable, and the light never changed, and he must have slept because he dreamed Caelindra's voice multiplied, coming from directions that didn't correspond to any single fixed point, and irregular verbs stretched across more dimensions than 3, and then he woke up to the sound of alarms that were a different frequency than anything he'd heard before, lower and more urgent, carrying in their resonance something that felt less like alert and more like warning, and in the walls around him, the stone began, very quietly, to vibrate. Chapter 4. Every version of this moment, the vibration in the walls built slowly at first. The way pressure changes before a storm, gradual enough that you could almost convince yourself it wasn't happening, that it was background noise, structural settling, something architectural and ordinary. Eli sat on the bench and felt it through the stone under his palms and did not convince himself of anything. He'd been in the cell for what his internal clock estimated at 6 hours. The light had never changed. The air recycler had cycled through its low mechanical hum at intervals he'd started counting. Something to do with the time. 14 cycles, approximately 40 minutes each, give or take. The vibration deepened. He stood up. It wasn't a sound exactly. Not only a sound, it was a frequency that got into the body before it reached the ears. The kind of thing that made you aware of your own skeleton in a way that was not comfortable. The wall to his left had begun, very slightly, to shimmer at its edges. Not the bioluminescent pulse of normal palace stone, but something else. Something irregular. Like the material was having second thoughts about its own consistency. From somewhere above 2 levels, maybe 3, he heard what sounded like crystal shattering. Then, faint but unmistakable, through whatever dampening the lower levels provided. A sound like thunder, except there was no weather on this level, and the frequency of it was wrong for anything meteorological. Then, closer someone running. The door didn't open. The locking mechanism simply stopped being a locking mechanism. It didn't break. Didn't force the crystalline structure of it, rearranged itself at what Eli could only describe as the molecular level. Matter making a different choice, and then the door was open and Lysara was standing in the frame. She'd crossed several levels of the palace at speed. She also looked like something had cracked in her composure, not broken. She was too controlled for that. But the surface of it had developed a fault line he hadn't seen before. Her robes were slightly disordered. Her expression was doing the specific thing that expressions did when every available option was bad, and you were picking between them in real time. She's fragmenting, Lasara said, without preamble. Complete psychic collapse. We have minutes. Eli was already moving toward the door. The dampeners aren't holding. The isolation protocols, she caught his arm as he came through. Not to stop him, to match him. They moved together. The isolation protocols are accelerating the breakdown. The complete cessation of your presence triggered a withdrawal cascade. Druven's model didn't account for. She cut herself off. I was wrong. He was wrong. Whatever you were doing, it wasn't creating dependency. It was providing structural support she'd already built into her stabilization process. Removing it removed the structure, Eli said, not the dependency. Yes. Her jaw tightened. She's taking the palace with her. The bioarchitecture is responding to her psychic state. It always does. It's designed to. But at this amplitude, it's becoming dangerous. 3 upper levels are experiencing temporal distortion. 7 members of staff are caught in localized probability loops. A pause that cost her something. We need you in the throne room, now. He didn't say anything about having been right. It wouldn't have been useful, and he didn't care about being right. Particularly. Tell me what I'm walking into. The worst case the literature describes. Her voice was steady, but it was a manufactured steadiness. The kind you built deliberately because falling apart wasn't available as an option. In full fragmentation. The consciousness doesn't collapse, it distributes across parallel timelines, parallel probability states. Multiple versions of herself existing simultaneously, none of them stable. All of them pulling in different directions. She stopped at a door that opened before she touched it, not by rearrangement this time, but because the guard on the other side had heard them coming and moved fast. She's phasing. Her physical cohesion is degrading. Our instruments are reading her in 6 distinct probability states right now, and the number is increasing. They moved through the corridor at a pace that was close to running without quite being it. The Regent's pace the fastest she could move, while still looking like she'd chosen to move at that speed. Around them, the palace was doing things that Eli had no framework for. The breathing of the walls had become arrhythmic, stuttering. The bioluminescent veins pulsing in patterns that looked less like neural activity and more like a system trying to compensate for something it wasn't designed to compensate for. Twice they passed guards who were standing completely still in positions that were slightly wrong, not frozen in normal stillness, but suspended, caught mid-motion at strange angles. The air around them rippling with the specific visual distortion that Eli had learned to associate with temporal displacement. On the upper level, a doorway opened onto 3 different destinations simultaneously. He could see all 3 different corridors, different lighting conditions. One of them showing a version of the same space that appeared to be structurally damaged. He and Lysara went through the right-hand option without slowing, and the other 2 possibilities collapsed behind them. Has anyone else tried to reach her? He said. Sariel and 2 other physicians were in the throne room when it started. They got out before it became too unstable. Sariel said, a pause. She said the space around Caelindra is fracturing. That standing near her is like standing near a window, breaking in slow motion, except the window is reality. That's precise. Sariel is precise. The final corridor before the throne room was the worst. The walls here were fully translucent, not the subtle shimmer of light fragmentation, but transparent, showing layered versions of the same space stacked through time like geological strata. He could see this corridor as it had been built. Centuries ago. The original stone, before the bioarchitecture, had grown through it. He could see a version of it partially destroyed. Rubble and broken spires visible through what should have been solid wall. He could see versions that had never existed outside of probability, a corridor that curved differently. A corridor with different lighting. A corridor from a timeline where someone had made a different decision about floor plan 60 years ago, and everything downstream of it had shifted accordingly. He walked through all of them at once and tried not to think too hard about what that meant. The throne room doors had stopped being doors. The frame was still there. The space where the doors had been was now an open threshold, and through it. The throne room presented itself in a way that didn't entirely align with the laws of space he'd grown up with. The floor was visible. The walls were visible. The high-vaulted non-ceiling overhead was doing something complicated with light and probability that he couldn't resolve into a stable image. And in the centre of it all, above the floor, 2 feet above it, then 3. Then the number seemed to change depending on when exactly you measured was Caelindra, or what was currently the best available approximation of Caelindra occupying a single point in space. She was overlapping with herself. There was no better phrase for it. He could see her, the her he'd spent the past 3 weeks in the resonance garden with. The her who made conditional constructions with vindictive enthusiasm and made jokes about semicolons and looked at irregular verbs like they were a problem she'd decided to win and layered through her. Like images projected on the same screen at different exposures were other versions. Some were recognizable, younger, older, different clothing, different expressions. Some were harder to pass versions that seemed to exist at different points in the Empire's history. Versions from timelines that had clearly gone differently in ways he couldn't identify from the visual alone. One of them, he made himself not look at it for too long, appeared to show a version of this room as ruins. All of them occupied the same space. All of them were, in some functional sense, present. All of them were pulling. The medic said Lasara started. I know what they said. He was already walking forward. He felt her hand on his arm, not the directional grip of someone showing the way, but a restraining grip. The grip of someone who genuinely wasn't sure about what they were watching him walk toward. Eli. She used his name without apparently deciding to. Be careful. I'll be careful, he said, and crossed the threshold. The psychic pressure hit him like stepping out of a pressurized environment. Not painful, exactly sharp. Immediate. Pervasive. A sensation that came in through every sense at once and didn't fit into any of them. His vision doubled briefly, showing him overlapping versions of the room. His ears registered harmonics stacked so deep and so multiple that they stopped being sound and started being texture. Something in the air tasted like static and copper and something he didn't have a name for. He kept walking. About 15 feet from where she was suspended in the air. The floor stopped being reliable. In a literal sense, it was still there under his feet. Structurally sound, but it felt optional. Like it was participating through choice rather than physics. He could feel, at the edge of perception, the pull she'd described, the sensation of multiple timelines existing within the same moment, each one as real as this one, each one offering itself as a viable reality. He pushed through it, 5 feet. Close enough that the harmonic pressure in the air was something he was breathing rather than just feeling. He could see her face clearly now, not a single face, but faces. Layered, all of them hers. Each one expressing something different. The one closest to the surface. Closest to the version he knew. Had its eyes closed and its expression tight with effort. The kind of effort that had been sustained too long. Caelindra, nothing. The effort in her expression deepened. He tried again. And this time he pushed everything he had into the register, every hour of hard-won calibration from the past 3 weeks. Every fractional adjustment of pitch and pace that he'd learned matched the particular frequency of her attention. Not louder, more present, more there. Caelindra, I'm here. Her eyes opened. Not all of them, the versions of her that were present in other timelines, didn't respond, but the one he knew. The one he'd been teaching irregular verbs to every morning and arguing about logical fallacies within council chambers that one's eyes opened, and they found him. And something in her expression shifted from effort into something else. Not relief. Not quite. Something more like recognition, which was something different and better. Eli. Her voice came from multiple directions simultaneously. The harmonic quality of it fractured and amplified. each version of her voice arriving at a slightly different temporal point, so that the word kept arriving and arriving and arriving. I can't, there are too many. Too many timelines. Too many versions of who I could have been. Too many directions to be pulled in. I know. He took another step forward. The floor was doing something under his feet that he decided not to fully acknowledge. I know. You need to go back. The architecture's failing if the fragmentation completes. The discharge will... I know what the discharge will do. Another step. He was close enough to see the tremor in her hands now. The specific fine tremor from the first evening in the East study, amplified enormously, running through every version of her simultaneously. I'm not going anywhere. That's a pause. All of her paused. That's not rational. Probably not. He stopped. He was 4 feet from her, close enough to see her eyes clearly. The way they were cycling through that rapid contraction and expansion, tracking multiple distances at once, tracking the multiple timelines she was being pulled toward. Can I tell you something? Now, he kept his voice the way he'd learned to keep it flat, steady, immediate. The voice of someone for whom this room, this moment, this specific conversation was the only thing currently happening in the universe. You told me once that when I'm near, you feel singular, that you exist in one place. One time, don't. Her voice fractured across the harmonic layers. Don't do this right now. I can't. I need you to hear it right now. Not because he'd calculated the timing. Because it was true. And it had been true for a while. And the time for being careful about it had just run out. The thing that anchors you to a single timeline, the reason my presence stabilizes you. The reason the grammar works. The reason the verb drills pull you back when everything else is pulling you forward. I don't think it's my voice or my neural architecture or anything clinical. I think it's that I am consistently, genuinely, without any reservation. In the room you're in, he held her gaze. All the versions of her gaze that he could find. I love you. This version of you. This timeline. This specific, singular, aggressively complicated moment. The chamber held. For 3 full seconds, nothing changed. The fractured timelines continued overlapping. The versions of her continued pulling. And Eli stood in the middle of it with his heart rate doing something. His voice wasn't going to admit to, and his weight on a floor that wasn't entirely committed to physics. Then, slowly first at the edges. Then moving inward, the overlapping versions began to converge. Not disappearing. He got the sense that they didn't disappear, that the timelines themselves continued to exist somewhere in the architecture of probability. But they were receding, like sound fading from a room rather than being cut off, like the tide pulling back from a high water line. The versions of Caelindra that had been layered through each other began to clarify, the overlapping exposures condensing, converging, collapsing inward toward a single point. The harmonic fracturing in her voice resolved. Her physical form solidified gradually, a few frames at a time. The phasing that had been making her intermittently translucent, reversing itself until she was simply, entirely, completely there, 3-dimensional, present, singular. Her weight, which had not been in any relation to gravity for the past however long, remembered itself and she dropped. He caught her. They went down together. Not elegantly, his knees hit the floor. Her weight came into his arms at an angle, and they ended up in a graceless collapse on the throne room floor, with her half against him, and both of them breathing like they'd been running. The floor, to its credit, was solid under them. The walls had stopped being translucent. The overhead space had given up whatever it had been doing with light and probability and simply gone back to being architectural. Caelindra pressed her face into his shoulder and said nothing for a moment. He could feel her breathing slowly normalizing ragged at first, then longer, then beginning to find its own rhythm. The tremor in her hands, still present, was already diminishing. Around them, the throne room was very quiet. Then she said, muffled against his shoulder, that was extremely manipulative. Her voice. One voice. The right voice. The one he knew. The one with the harmonics that were currently doing something warm and exhausted rather than fractured and multiplied. Was it working? Obviously it was working. I'm corporeal, aren't I? She pulled back far enough to look at him. Her eyes were clear tired. The bone deep, tired of someone who'd been fighting something enormous. Clear, focused, here. That doesn't mean it wasn't manipulative. I was going to tell you anyway, he said. The existential crisis just accelerated the timeline. That might be the least romantic thing anyone has ever said. I can write something more formal, with correct use of the present perfect. She stared at him for a moment, with an expression that was doing several things simultaneously. Then, despite everything, despite the exhausted weight of her against him, and the throne room around them, and the sound of rapid footsteps approaching from the corridor, she laughed. Genuine, surprised, the kind that caught her out the same way it had the first evening in the East Study, short and real and exactly itself. The sound of it moved through the throne room's architecture like a tuning fork, clean and resonant, and the remaining tension in the space, the residual frequency distortion. The last few visual shimmer effects at the wall edges cleared. Lysara arrived first, moving at a speed that was not disguised as anything other than what it was. Behind her, Sariel and a medical team, equipment already running. They deployed around them with practiced efficiency, and Eli sat very still and let them work. Because Caelindra needed the scan and the readout and the clinical reassurance, and he was the obstacle in the middle of the floor who would be accessible later. He watched Sariel's face as she reviewed the initial readings. He'd learned, over the past weeks, to read Sariel's expressions around medical data the way you'd read anyone's face in a high-stakes professional situation carefully, looking for what the expression was doing rather than what it was showing. What it was showing now was professional composure. What it was doing was trying, with partial success, to contain something that was not professional composure. The transformation has stabilized. She said it once, clearly, and then she said nothing else for a moment, looking at the readout as though she needed to read it several times. Her telepathic matrix has integrated. Not partially, completely. The restructuring is, she stopped. Looked up. This has never been documented. A Ketherasine subject has never completed the transition without full isolation. The literature describes this outcome as impossible, Caelindra said, from Eli's shoulder, where she had returned to resting. The literature uses the word unrecorded. Sariel said, I'll update the literature. Lysara, who had been standing at the edge of the medical team's perimeter, with the expression of someone counting things they'd almost lost and not wanting to reach the total, looked at Eli with a steadiness that had a different quality than the steadiness she'd walked through the lower palace with. Less manufactured. More arrived at. Where is Druven? Caelindra asked. She hadn't moved from where she was, but her voice had taken on its formal register, not the sharp, cooled temperature drop she'd used to dismiss him from the study, the flat. Settled authority of someone who'd just survived something significant and come out the other side with clarity about several things they'd been uncertain about before. House arrest. Pending formal investigation into the unauthorized use of emergency protocols. Lysara's jaw was controlled. He will argue that he acted in the Empire's best interest. He probably believes it, Eli said. Both of them looked at him. People who confuse tradition with evidence usually do. He adjusted his position slightly to make Caelindra more comfortable and tried to look like someone whose knees were not complaining loudly about throne room floors. It doesn't make them malicious. It makes them a specific kind of wrong, the kind that's harder to argue with because the conviction is genuine. You're defending him, Caelindra said. I'm explaining him. Defending would require more sympathy than I currently have available. He looked at Lysara. What happens now? Medical review. For the next several days. Sariel answered before Lysara could, which Eli suspected was a measure of how much the physician had to say about the next several days. Complete psychic integration monitoring. New baseline documentation, all of it. Her Highness will need rest. Structured exposure to her new capacity. Careful management of the first few weeks of adjusted psionic range. A pause, and she'll need her anchor. Her anchor, Eli repeated. The function your presence serves in her stabilization architecture. Sariel said it with the brisk practicality of someone who had fully accepted an inexplicable clinical fact and moved on to its implications. We don't have precise language for it yet. The data is clear enough your presence. Specifically, maintains a grounding function in her probability orientation. Removing it produced the cascade we just contained. Maintaining it appears to produce, she looked at the readout again this. She means, Caelindra said, without lifting her face from his shoulder, that leaving is no longer an uncomplicated option. I wasn't planning on leaving, Eli said. I know. A pause, but I want to be explicit about it. Because I'd like you to choose it, not feel obligated to it. He looked down at the top of her head, the dark hair he'd been carefully not noticing for 3 weeks, the elegantly swept ear catching the throne room's light from this angle. The medical team moved around them, efficient and professional, giving them the specific courtesy of an unacknowledged conversation. When you asked me, he said, why I took this assignment, what I told you about not living versus existing, I remember. I want to be clear that whatever I said then is still true now, and that this... He made a small gesture that encompassed the throne room and the settling architecture and the general aftermath of a psychic catastrophe that had just reversed itself. This is not obligation. This is the most genuinely alive I've been in years, and most of it has been terrifying, and I'd make the same choice again. Caelindra lifted her head and looked at him. The clearness in her eyes now had an additional quality, not just the clarity of the present moment, but something wider. The depth of a perception that had just fundamentally restructured itself. He understood, looking at her, that the mind he was looking at now was not the same mind she'd had this morning. Same person. Different architecture. Something more complete. I love you too, she said. In case you needed it said directly. I generally prefer direct. I know. She settled back. I'm very tired. You just survived fragmenting across 6 simultaneous timelines. 6, Sariel confirmed from several feet away, without looking up. We recorded 6 distinct probability states. Only 6, Caelindra said, with something that was almost wry. Rest, Eli said. The grammar can wait. The summit cannot wait. 6 months. 17 species, 5 months and 3 weeks now. And you just fully integrated a complete telepathic restructuring that no one in recorded Miravani history has survived. The summit can wait approximately 1 week. She was quiet for a moment. Then, you're going to be insufferable now that you've saved my life. I'm going to be the same as I always was, which is insufferable. Specifically, arguably, but comprehensible, which in my experience matters more. She finished. Yes, you've said that. She closed her eyes. Thank you. For the irregular verbs. For the semicolons. For coming into the room when every sensible person would have backed away. He didn't have a linguistic construction for what he wanted to say to that. He sat with her in the settling quiet of the throne room, the architecture breathing again. Normally, in its slow rhythmic way, and let that be enough for now. Above them, through the upper architecture, the twin stars of Miravan were setting. The palace lit itself in stages. The bioluminescent veins in its stone casting everything in the warm amber copper light that made even throne rooms look like somewhere a person might, eventually, feel at ease. Lasara stood at the edge of the room and watched them with an expression she wasn't performing for anyone in particular, and said nothing. And that was its own kind of answer to several questions Eli suspected he and the regent would be having formal conversations about soon. He'd worry about that later. Right now. The floor was solid and the walls were stone, and Caelindra was breathing steadily against his shoulder. And reality had remembered how to be singular, and that was more than enough. Chapter 5, The Weight of One Timeline 3 months later. Eli stood at the edge of the resonance garden and watched Caelindra make a flower bloom out of sequence. Not dramatically, not with visible effort or theatrical gesture. She was standing in the centre of the courtyard with a delegation of 6 representatives from the Varathi Compact, a species that communicated primarily through bioluminescent skin patterns and had, according to the cultural briefing, a deep philosophical investment in the concept of natural order. And she was explaining something about probability management that Eli could only follow about 70% of, which was an improvement over 3 months ago, when the number had been closer to 0. As she spoke, one of the garden's night-blooming varieties, the ones that typically opened after the second star set, opened fully, immediately, without any of the slow progressive stages it was supposed to go through. The Varathi delegate's skin patterns shifted through what Eli had been told indicated impressed attention, and Caelindra moved on to the next point, with the composure of someone who had stopped being surprised by what she could do and had started simply doing it. That was the change he'd watched happen over 3 months, and it was stranger and more remarkable than he had words for. Not the capacity itself, though the capacity was significant. The ability to consciously orient probability fields in ways that the physicians were still documenting and the theoretical physicists were still arguing about. It was the settledness of it. The transformation that had been tearing her apart in 6 simultaneous directions had completed, integrated, become simply the shape of how her mind worked. She woke up in the morning with this. She had breakfast with this. She taught him Miravani irregular verbs over evening meals, with this running in the background, a hum rather than a storm. She was, the medical team had said, the most documented case in the history of Cetharasin. She was also, as she had pointed out crisply when this was mentioned for the 3rd time, a person rather than a case. And she would appreciate the distinction being remembered. The Varathi delegation moved through the garden's eastern section, following the tour path that Caelindra had apparently designed herself, curated to demonstrate specific applications of probability orientation in ways that would be legible to a species that thought about the universe in terms of pattern coherence rather than linear causality. Eli had helped with the conceptual framing, finding common language that could carry the meaning across while respecting the Varathi conceptual system, and had then stepped back, because his function in this particular demonstration was to not visibly be part of the demonstration. Chancellor Druven, currently in comfortable house arrest in his family estate on the Empire's 2nd moon, was reportedly writing a treatise on traditional values and the dangers of external influence on psionic development. Nobody was expected to read it in any formal capacity. Several people were expected to read it anyway, for the entertainment value. Eli had declined on both counts. After the Varathi departed with the formal chromatic patterns that indicated satisfied diplomatic exchange, their skin cycling through golds and blues as they went, Caelindra crossed the garden to where Eli had been sitting on the bench he'd occupied for 3 months of morning sessions, which had been his in all but designation, and which the palace staff now kept clear for him with the quiet, matter-of-fact efficiency of an institution that had reclassified certain things as simply the way things were. She sat beside him, not across the garden on the floating platform, not in the formal arrangement of teacher and student with appropriate spatial protocol. She sat beside him on the bench and let out a breath that was not quite a sigh, and was not quite relief, and was somewhere between the two that she'd started making after particularly demanding demonstrations in the past few weeks, when the official part of the day gave way to the rest of it. How was the conceptual framing? She asked. The 3rd Varathi, 2nd from the left, changed their pattern to something that the briefing materials describe as indicating expanded interest during your probability explanation. The framing worked. The 3rd one is their theoretical physicist. She's been sceptical. Caelindra looked at the garden, the flowers still doing their slow, informed drifting. Getting the theoretical physicist is better than getting the diplomats. Diplomats will say the right things regardless. Theoretical physicists only react when something actually lands. That's very true. She was quiet for a moment. The garden hummed around them. I've been thinking about something. Usually a reliable indicator that something interesting is about to be said. The summit is in 11 weeks. I know. I've been preparing the linguistic frameworks for the simultaneous address, the one where you're speaking common, but the semantic scaffolding needs to load bear for 17 different conceptual systems at once. It's either going to be the most elegant piece of applied linguistics I've produced, or a diplomatic catastrophe of historical proportions. I have complete confidence. That makes one of us. She turned to look at him, and there it was, the direct quality of her attention, the one that hadn't changed since the first evening in the East study, even though everything around it had. She was looking at him with the expression she used when she was actually going to say what she was thinking, rather than an adjacent version of it. "After the summit," she said. "After the summit," he agreed, waiting. "Your original assignment was 6 months. The summit is effectively the conclusion of the work you were contracted to do." A pause. "Technically, the position terminates after the summit. Technically. Aunt Lasara drafted a formal extension 3 weeks ago. She gave it to me to sign rather than presenting it through official channels, which I think was her way of telling me the decision was mine." Another pause, shorter. "I haven't signed it yet." He looked at her. Because I want to know, and I want an actual answer. The same kind you gave me in the corridor that night when I asked why you came here, whether you want to stay because you want to, or because you've been here long enough that staying has become the path of least resistance. Those are different things, and they produce different futures. The garden was very quiet. The second star had dropped behind the western ridge, and the light had gone the amber copper of a late afternoon. The kind that made everything look slightly more considered than it usually did, of least resistance. Eli said slowly. "Would have been staying on Earth. In my office. Teaching the seminar I'd taught for 7 years." He watched a flower in the garden drift through a slow rotation that had nothing to do with wind. The path of least resistance from here would be to go back to that. It would be simple, predictable. My career would probably recover from the gap. I could write the paper about applied linguistics in psionic diplomatic contexts, get several excellent publications, return to tenure with an interesting story. That's not an answer. I'm getting there. He turned to look at her directly. "I've been in this garden for 3 months. I've watched you learn to hold a probability field with conscious precision without it taking anything out of you. I've watched you prepare for a summit that would have been beyond most diplomats in this system and approach it like a problem you've decided to be better at than anyone. I've had arguments with you about reported speech and the ethics of indirect address and what constitutes a necessary versus ornamental semicolon. And those arguments have been more genuinely engaging than anything in the last 4 years of my career." He paused. "The question isn't whether I want to stay. The question was never that." She waited. "The question is whether staying is the right thing, for you, specifically." He held her gaze. "You are going to be the most powerful psionic mind your civilization has produced in 8 generations. You are about to address 17 species on behalf of an empire. Your capacity to influence probability fields means that people around you will increasingly have complicated feelings about whether their choices are entirely their own. And managing that is going to be one of the defining political and ethical challenges of your reign." He kept his voice even. "If what I am to you is primarily an anchor, a functional stabilization mechanism that helped you through the transformation, then building your court around that anchor is a structural dependency that your advisors are right to be cautious about." Kalindra looked at him for a long moment. The amber light was doing something to the edge of her ears. The bronze highlights that she'd never seemed to notice, but that he'd been carefully not noticing since the first week. "And if you're not primarily an anchor," she said, "then I'd need to hear that from you. Not from Sariel's clinical notes. From you." She was quiet for long enough that a garden cycle completed the flowers going through one full rotation of their slow, informed drift before settling back to roughly where they'd been. The hum of the resonant stone under the bench rose and fell with it. "The first evening," Caelindra said, "when you moved toward me instead of backing away. I've thought about that moment a great deal in the past 3 months. All the versions of it." A pause. "I have access to probability fields now in a way I didn't before. I can see. With a specificity that I could not have imagined 3 months ago. How outcomes shift with different choices. It's not prescience. I want to be precise about this. It's more like statistical depth. The ability to feel the weight of different possibilities before they become events. What does that feel like? Like standing in a river and being able to sense the current rather than just being moved by it." She looked at her hands for a moment. Then back at him. I have spent 3 months being able to do this, and in all of that time, across every probability orientation, I've run on questions about my own future, which Sariel tells me I do too frequently, and I have told Sariel I will do exactly as frequently as I decide to in all of that time, in every version I can wait. The futures where you stay are better, better for the Empire, for your reign, better for me, she said it simply, which I have decided to prioritise, on the grounds that I am the one living this particular life, and if I cannot make decisions about my own futures, I am not clear what my new capacity is actually for. A beat. You are not primarily an anchor. You are the person who recited irregular verbs at me while reality was disintegrating, and who argued with a formal council about logical fallacies on my behalf, and who noticed something was wrong with my probability field before I did, and adjusted his cadence for it without making a production of the fact that he'd noticed. She looked at him steadily. You are the person I want to be difficult at for a very long time. Eli sat with this. The second star had fully set now, and the garden was lit by the first star alone, which produced a cooler, bluer light that the flowers responded to, with a shift in their movement pattern slightly more compressed, slightly more directed. I'll need to negotiate the terms of the extension, he said finally. I want it on the record that this isn't a standard diplomatic position and shouldn't be compensated as one. I will tell Aunt Lysara. She'll negotiate aggressively on the Empire's behalf out of principle and then give you everything you asked for. I know. I've watched her negotiate. He paused. You called me your linguistic advisor. To the Varathi delegation. Yes, it's the official designation. The Varathi delegate the diplomat. Not the theoretical physicist asked his accompanying aide. Something in their bioluminescent notation system when you used that phrase. And the aide's response pattern indicated amusement. I think the official designation has a reputation. Kalindra's expression did something complicated. The Varathi have extremely accurate gossip networks. It's one of the things I like about them. Meaning the palace staff has been talking. The palace staff has been talking for approximately 2.5 months, she said, without apparent distress. I'm aware. I made a decision not to address it officially because addressing it officially gives it a political weight that it doesn't need to have. It's simpler to let the gossip networks do what gossip networks do and focus on the work. That's very pragmatic. I've been told I'm pragmatic to a degree that concerns people. It doesn't concern me. I know. A pause. That's one of the things that doesn't concern me either. The eastern terrace of the palace caught the last light of the first star and held it longer than the rest of the building. Some quality of the stone, or its orientation, keeping the warmth after the source of it had technically moved on. Eli had found this terrace in his second week and had visited it periodically, since it was one of the few outdoor spaces in the palace complex that didn't require navigating formal protocols or explaining his presence to anyone, and it had a view of the city below and the ridge beyond and, on clear evenings, enough sky to remind him that the universe was large in a way he found, in moderate doses, useful. Kaelindra had started appearing on it around his 6th week, which neither of them had commented on directly. They were there now, side by side on the low wall that ran along the terrace edge, the city below going through its evening bioluminescent cycle, the towers breathing their soft rhythmic light into the darkening air. Can I ask you something? She said. You usually follow that with the thing you were going to ask regardless. True, but I want to do it correctly. She looked at him with the careful attention she brought to things she'd been thinking about for a while. In the throne room, when you said what you said, yes. You've had 3 months to reconsider the circumstances under which you said it. The circumstances were, objectively, extreme. She kept her voice even, but he'd had 3 months to learn the difference between her even voice and her actually even voice. And this was the former. I want to know if what you said was what you would have said in different circumstances, in a room that wasn't disintegrating, with more preparation time. He understood the question. He understood, more specifically, why she was asking it not in security, not in the conventional sense, but precision. She'd always wanted precision. Now she had an entire rebuilt psychic architecture oriented around probability fields, and she was applying it to this, which meant she needed the answer to be accurate rather than reassuring. I would have said it eventually, he said. The throne room accelerated my timeline. But the content was true before I said it, and would have been true if I'd said it on an ordinary afternoon in the garden, over a debate about the semicolon. You seem very confident about that. I had 4 years of being careful. I'm fairly certain about the difference between what I feel and what I'm prepared to say. She was quiet for a moment. The city below pulsed through a wave of coordinated bioluminescence, the towers responding to some signal he couldn't read. A ripple of light moving from the centre outward, like a stone dropped in water. My ears, she said. He looked at her. You told me 3 months ago, in the garden, before everything happened. You told me I was terrible at hiding when something was bothering me. She reached up self-consciously, that my ears moved. Twitched, he corrected. Specifically, the right one. When you're working through something you haven't resolved yet, the right ear shifts by about 3 degrees. It's subtle. I noticed it in the second week. I do not twitch. You absolutely do. It's one of the most reliable indicators I've found for calibrating when to shift the lesson pace. She lowered her hand and looked at him with an expression that was deciding something about how annoyed to be. That is deeply unfair. I've been trying for months to figure out how you knew when to adjust before I showed any other sign. Now you know. 3 degrees, she said, with the tone of someone filing something away permanently. 3 degrees. Right side. Slightly forward. He watched the city lights below. You did it just now. When you asked me about the throne room, a pause. I'm going to learn to control that. Probably. Your control has improved significantly across the board. He looked at her. I'll miss it. She turned to look at him, and the first star's remaining light was doing something to the angles of her face that he'd stopped trying not to notice at some point he couldn't precisely identify, and she was looking at him with the full attention quality. The one that had been slightly beyond comfortable in the East study 3 months ago, and had since become simply the way she looked at him when she was actually looking. I'm glad you stayed, she said, simply, without ceremony, the way she said things she'd decided to be honest about. I'm glad I stayed too. He paused. Though I want it on the record that the non-coffee in this palace is still an offence against the concept of coffee. I'll put it in the official record. The human linguistic advisor objects to the coffee analogue, officially. The corner of her mouth moved. I've been working on something. A request. For the summit there's an opening address. Before the 17 species session begins, it's traditionally delivered in High Imperial, which nobody outside the Empire speaks fluently, which has historically made it a formality more than an actual communication. You want to change that. I want to deliver it in common, with the appropriate conceptual framework loaded for each attending species simultaneously. She looked at him. I'm told that's either impossible or the most ambitious applied linguistic undertaking attempted in this system. It's both. He thought about it. We'd need to build structural layers into the address from the ground up, not just translate but architect the meaning, so it carries across 17 different cognitive frameworks simultaneously without losing coherence in any of them. He was already thinking through the methodology. It would take every one of the 11 weeks we have, and it would be the hardest thing I've ever done professionally. I know. I want to start tomorrow. She smiled, the real one. The one that still occasionally surprised her. The one that had first appeared in the East study over a joke about insurance, and which had not become less itself in 3 months of practice. We'll start at 9. And Eli? Yes. Bring the semicolons. I've decided they're interesting after all. I know, he said. You've been using them correctly for 6 weeks. I noticed. She shook her head in the way. She shook her head when she was not quite exasperated and not quite pleased, and occupying the exact space between the two. And then, because the first star was nearly down, and the city below was at full bioluminescent cycle, and the terrace was warm and quiet, and there was no formal protocol for what this was, or needed to be, she leaned in and kissed him, not dramatically, not as punctuation to a declaration or a climactic gesture in a long narrative arc, just she kissed him, and he kissed her back, and they stayed there while the last light moved off the palace stone, and the city breathed below them, and the garden, far beneath the terrace wall, continued its slow, deliberate drift, flowers moving in patterns that had, over 3 months, begun matching the rhythm of her heartbeat so thoroughly that the palace's own biometric systems had quietly updated their baseline records. When they stopped, she was looking at him with an expression that had several things in it and was not concealing any of them. "The summit," she said. "Then after the summit, we discussed the permanent terms of your position, officially, with full council documentation and a formal title that accurately reflects what you actually do, which is," she considered, "linguistic advisor, probability anchor, the person who recited irregular verbs at me while reality was actively disintegrating." A pause. "I'm told official titles should be concise. Linguistic advisor covers most of it, she agreed. "The rest we can leave undocumented." Below them, the city pulsed through another wave of light, slower this time, moving in the direction of evening. The palace hummed around them in its slow bioarchitectural breath. The living stone responding to the particular quality of stillness that had settled over the terrace warmth without charge, quiet without absence. 3 months ago, this building had been tearing itself apart in resonance with Caelindra's fragmenting consciousness, its walls becoming translucent, its corridors folding between timelines, its stone forgetting how to commit to a single version of itself. Now it breathed like a thing that knew where it was, somewhere in the diplomatic quarter. The preliminary summit communications were already running 17 species, 3 working languages, 11 weeks to build the most ambitious address in the history of the Luminant Empire. Somewhere on the second moon, a former Chancellor was writing a treatise that would be read by people who wanted to feel confirmed in things they already believed, which was its own kind of audience and would no doubt produce its own kind of influence, modest and fading, somewhere in the medical archive. Saravel was adding to the documentation of the first fully completed Ketheracin on record, building a clinical literature out of something that had previously existed only as a warning in the historical texts. The theoretical physicists were still arguing about the mechanism. They would probably argue about it for a while. Eli sat on the terrace wall with the future queen of the Luminant Empire and watched the city go through its evening rhythms, and thought about the fact that 6 months ago he'd been in an office on Earth, teaching the same seminar for the 7th consecutive year, slowly calcifying into a piece of furniture, and he thought about the shuttle descent and the copper-tasting air and the first sight of the palace rising out of the canopy like a frozen scream of architectural ambition, and the moment he'd looked at Caelindra for the first time and thought that the photographs had not done an accurate job. He thought about 3 degrees, right side, slightly forward, about irregular verbs in a corridor where the walls were doing something walls were not supposed to do, about the specific, irreducible singularity of this timeline over all the others, and the fact that out of every possible version of this moment, spread across every probability field, that Caelindra's rebuilt psionic architecture could now reach and measure and consciously orient out of all of them. They were in this one. He thought that was probably enough. More than enough, actually. He thought that was. Quietly and without any drama whatsoever. Everything.